Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And it's that time of year again. We've done this for the past couple of years. Third year in a row we've done this, replaying old shows of Kevin Dorn from the archives. Some of these are really good shows, too. This one in particular is today. It's from January 2005. Kevin Dorn speaking with historian Robert Ferrell. And there's a great story in this that Kevin Dorn tells about the time Kevin almost met Prince Philip from England. Anyways, here we go from January 2005.
Bob Ferrell, noted historian. We have him back again today. Bob is the author or editor of well over 50 books. He wrote a biography of every president from McKinley through Eisenhower. This is because that series on the presidents last week that ran on the History Channel, which I thought was very, very good. It had to be because of the nature of it, rather superficial, spending maybe 8 minutes on each president. But nevertheless, very, very interesting. Bob, let's go back. Let's talk about Calvin Coolidge a little bit. He president from 23 to 33. Is that right?
29.
No, 29. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's right.
Speaking of correction, actually, my first book on a president was Wilson, not McKinley.
Oh, I thought you wrote one on McKinley.
Well, I'd like to think that were true.
Well, you told me something about McKinley, made me think you did some research on him.
I know a story or two about McKinley, but that's about it.
He was shot not far from here, up in Buffalo,
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
And then T.R.
And then Taft.
And, he's another guy that's an interesting figure, William Howard Taft. He never really wanted to be president, according to that series. He wanted to go on the Supreme Court, and in fact, he ended up being there, didn't he?
He did, although when these people say, Kevin, that they don't want to be president, I'd say not merely 9 out of 10, 99 out of 100. I don't believe that for a minute.
Yeah. Yeah, I doubt that very much, because you could always say, no, that's not for me.
Well, this is a tradition in American politics. You always say that the office should come to the man, but as you well know, the men go to the office.
There was a guy who I think was Roosevelt TR's first choice, a guy named Elihu Root.
Oh, yeah.
He was a Secretary of State, I believe.
He was, yeah.
And I knew Elihu's probably his great-nephew. Yeah.
Oh.
I better not say too much. He and I didn't get along too well, and he was a very distinguished guy, a very distinguished lawyer, and he helped Wilkie in 1940. Elihu Root, whatever. This guy's name wasn't Elihu. And the reason you remember that is how many guys you know named Elihu.
That's a name that, it's sort of like Hepzibah. You don't find that name anymore.
No, it was a 19th century name, yeah.
That's right.
All right, Calvin Coolidge.
I have a little story about Coolidge, and I think it's true that when Coolidge was vice president, he went to see General Pershing, and he now, after I start the story, I'm not so sure I can tell the rest of it. It was something about Pershing turned him off by saying that the man should come to the office rather than the office to the man or something. I back up on that one, Kevin. I think I'm just plain wrong.
Blackjack Pershing, he had some designs in the presidency, didn't he?
Yes. Oh, yeah. He actually was photographed with a suit, which he hadn't worn for quite a while, in 1920. But he was a terrible speaker, Kevin. He, from what I read, he just couldn't hardly say 5 words without boring people. Just put them to sleep, and you can't do that. Even then, you couldn't do it.
This is interesting because our presidents now, we'll have all their stuff on tape and video. We'll be able to watch them. But not that very long ago, in the 20th century, we didn't have that information, did we?
No.
We have to guess at it.
If we did, they spoke into horns, and there were no overtones in their speech, and they all just didn't sound very good.
Now, Wilson was supposed to be a wonderful speaker. Is that true?
That's true. I've heard a tape of him, and he had a deep bass voice, but I'm not so sure even of that because, again, you didn't have the tonal possibilities then that of course, you do now.
Well, let's go back to our friend Silent Cal Coolidge. Takes over when Harding dies, and then he runs on his own term. That's right. So he would have ended in 29 his presidency. What is your make on Coolidge?
Well, he was really a very bright fellow, and in his way very attractive, because he was a Yankee, not a Brahmin. He didn't come from Boston. He came from the back country, and those two types virtually hated each other. Lodge, Henry Cabot Lodge, the senator, who was in his way too attractive, but Lodge said at one point that, referring to Coolidge, that anyone who lived in a double house just didn't deserve the presidency.
Those guys did get off some great one-liners, didn't they? Huh?
Yes, and Coolidge moved there in 1905, and he stayed in that house during his presidency, and he went back there, except that in 1929-30, people would drive down the street, and they'd stop their cars right in front of him when he was sitting on the porch. They'd all point at him, and he just couldn't have too much of that. It was right on the street, virtually. He was a simple man, and I think, although he could be tart, a very decent person.
Mm-hmm. Had a tragedy in the White House, didn't he?
Yes, in 1924, his younger son, there were two boys, he had an infection, and they didn't have much you could do with infections in those days. And this child, he was, I think, 14 perhaps, died. Yeah. It was a tragic thing.
Now, let's move on to Hoover. We talked about him, so we'll go past him to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
You say that pretty well.
Well, Democrats think when they die, they're going to be judged by a guy from Dutchess County. But he did have that aura, did he not, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of being just kind of a superhuman sort of fellow, didn't he?
He did have that. One of his, I think you could say, close friends, and certainly a man who saw a lot of him. This was Judge Rosenman. Rosenman felt that you always knew when you were around FDR that he was the president. Mm-hmm. And you didn't want to call him Franklin. His mother might do that. His mother, published a book, I think it was 1940, was called My Boy Franklin.
Really? I never knew that.
I think maybe that was a little wrong, but she did that. But hardly anyone dared call him Franklin. He had an aura of control about him. And then he would describe people who came to see him by their first names, except General Marshall, who he tried that once with Marshall, and Marshall said that only his wife did that.
Otherwise, it's General.
Otherwise, it was General Marshall. Yeah.
Now,
I rather like that.
Two interesting characters there at that same time, both larger-than-life guys, both of them mama's boys, Douglas MacArthur and Franklin Roosevelt. Both mama's boys, weren't they?
They were, yes. Mrs. Arthur MacArthur, that is Douglas's mother, was something of a dragon lady. She must have been almost intolerable. When he went to West Point, she took a hotel room that would look right on his barracks room, and then, of course, every night the light would go out, and she knew that Douglas was safe until the morning. Imagine having a mother like that.
No.
No?
And you know the story about he brought back from the Philippines, when he was over there the first time, he brought back a rather attractive young lady. You know that story? I'm sure you do.
I think I've heard that one, yes.
And he was, let's tell it like it is, he was shacking up with her in Washington, and the word started to get around he had to get rid of her. He didn't want his mother to find out. And this is when he was well into his 30s, maybe his early 40s. He didn't want his mother to find out that he had this little on the side. There's also,
I think that is true, Kevin.
Isn't there also some truth to the story that he stole Pershing's mistress? Have you ever heard that one?
Yes, I have.
I think that's in Manchester's book.
This was a woman whom he married, I think, in 1922, Louise Cromwell Brooks. But that may have been her story rather than the truth.
Yeah, but Pershing never quite forgave him, as I understand it, and that's
a part of the story, that the MacArthur-Pershing feeling came from that. I think there was some feeling when MacArthur became Brigadier General. This was 1918. Pershing had sent in a list from France to Washington, and MacArthur was not on the list. And he was nonetheless promoted, and that, together with several other promotions that Pershing didn't approve of, this didn't go over very well.
Isn't it strange, Bob? We sit out here thinking that these guys are all, I don't know. They're not quite like we are. They don't have these little petty jealousies. And the fact is that they're worse than we are in many cases, aren't they?
I think they are. And in the military, the big thing is promotion. And in politics, it's getting there and staying there. And you and I don't have to bother with either one of those things.
Such a good show. We do have to interrupt it at this point to take a break. Stay with us. The Kevin Doran 2005 interview with historian Robert Ferrell will continue in just a moment.
Delicious homemade pies and cookies of all kinds, just like you'd bake yourself if only you had the time. It's okay because Country Kitchen will make them fresh and homemade for you. And it's so easy. Just call 324-4551, 324-4551, or place your order when you stop in for breakfast, lunch, or dinner any day. Don't forget they have gift certificates in any amount, and it always fits. The perfect gift or stocking stuffer. Country Kitchen Restaurant, Seneca Road in Hornell, open every day, ready to serve you.
And before we get back to the Kevin Doran show with historian Robert Ferrell from 2005, we're going to check in with meteorologist Rob Carolyn here on this Monday, December 23rd, 2019. What do you got in store for us today, Rob?
Some mild temperatures, Brian. In fact, temperatures which are going to be well above normal for the southern tier. It looks like cooler air does arrive tomorrow and on into Wednesday. But the good news is anybody traveling the next couple of days, well, the weather pattern's relatively quiet. High pressure over the northeast, keeping a big storm to our south. A lot of rain today, Florida on into eastern Georgia and the Carolinas. But that storm is diverted harmlessly off to our south. We'll enjoy a fair amount of sunshine and a high of 45 to 50. Not too bad 2 days after the winter solstice, Brian. Sunrise this morning, 7:37. Sunset tonight at 4:42. It's actually a couple of minutes later than it was last week. Tonight, we're going to see an increase in the cloudiness as the cooler weather heads our way. We're 25 to 30 overnight. Tomorrow, some morning cloudiness, followed by some sunshine in the afternoon. Not as warm. Highs tomorrow, 35 to 40. Christmas Eve tomorrow night, increasingly cloudy, 25 to 30. Christmas Day, lots of clouds, but temperatures should be somewhere between 40 and 45 Wednesday afternoon, Brian.
Nice little traditions developed here on the Newsmaker Show where we give our regular guests a break at the end of the year and the beginning of the new year. So for the last week of December and the first week of January, we play old shows from the archives with Kevin Doran hosting them. This one from January 2005 with historian Robert Ferrell.
Now, let's go on to FDR. I know you're a Democrat, and I know that you like FDR as a president. But I got the impression from talking to you several times that he wasn't your favorite person as a person. That Roosevelt lacked some qualities that you thought a man ought to have.
Now, Kevin, I think that's true. And this reminds me that when you were just a few years younger, you had entree to Blair House in Washington. And you knew a woman who ran the place and who saw these presidents, beginning with FDR.
Well, I didn't see the presidents, but I heard stories about them. Yeah,
Yes, what did you hear about FDR?
You warned me you were going to make me tell that story. Well, here's the story quickly. I was a disc jockey in Washington, D.C. in 1957. I didn't stay there long because I really didn't like it there.
You must have been 4 years old.
I was probably only about 20, to tell you the truth, 20, 21. Yeah, I was 20. So anyway, I was there briefly. I didn't like it, and I got out. But I was a disc jockey in the nation's capital. And one of the DJs at the station, a guy named Jerry Kearns, was raised in Blair House. The reason being his mother and father had divorced, and his grandmother ran Blair House. She was the official hostess, and she lived there. And so he grew up there. So when he would take me home for dinner, as guys did, for their pals, that's where we went. Well, little country boy from up in Steuben County going to Blair House. And I went there many, many times, and I would sit and talk with this lady whose name I can't remember anymore. She died in '62. I remember seeing it in Time magazine. And
Kevin, you perhaps should tell your listeners what Blair House is.
Oh, Blair House
is not so well known now.
Yeah, it's the official presidential guest house.
And Truman stayed there from
Truman
48
actually,
until 52.
He lived there for most of his presidency, yeah.
That's right.
And anyway, when there were events going on in Washington or famous characters came to Washington, they stayed at Blair House. So she knew Roosevelt. Roosevelt actually appointed her to the job. And she knew Truman very well because Truman lived there. And, of course, she knew Eisenhower. And I would sit there, and I got to tell you a funny story. One time, we were sitting there in her little living room. It wasn't a very big living room. It was very nice, but not very big. And the phone rang, and she said, "Oh, I don't think so this week." Well, wait a minute. What day was that again, Mrs. Dulles? Oh, yes. Sure, I could be there. Right. And so when she hung up, I said, I didn't say anything. She said, that was Mrs. Dulles, John Foster's wife, and they need me for bridge next week. I mean, she knew all these people and thought that was remarkable. But she said Roosevelt, when he came into the room, that if there was someone in the room who wasn't totally charmed by him, he would concentrate on that person until he had charmed him. Truman, on the other hand, and she thought he was wonderful, very down-to-earth guy, and she and Margaret continued to exchange letters in the 60s and also Bess. But she became very close friends with the Trumans, and she took me into the room where Truman decided to go into the Korean War, which, for me as a history buff, that was a very interesting thing. He came out of the room and said, "Well, Mrs. whatever her name was now, I've forgotten it, looks like we're going to go to war." And then she talked about Eisenhower. She described him as a very aloof guy. That big smile we used to see on television, that wasn't the way Eisenhower was on a one-to-one basis or when he wasn't on the stage, if you will. Now, why did you make me tell that story? You're the guy with all the interesting stories.
I think this is fascinating stuff, Kevin.
Well, it is, actually. I may have told that once or twice before, but it was an interesting thing for me. And I'll tell you one more story, then I'll stop. The king, the queen, and the prince consort, Duke of Edinburgh, they were coming to Washington, and they were supposed to stay at Blair House. Ended up they didn't, but they were supposed to. So one night we're having dinner, and she had a little dog. I don't know what kind of dog it was, a little terrier. And the terrier started to hemorrhage, started to bleed. And it ran upstairs through all the guest rooms, bleeding all the way. Ooh. So Jerry and I chased the dog, and I can't remember which one of us caught the dog. But in the process, I went through all these rooms. And here's something, this really impressed me. In Prince Philip's room, they had installed, are you ready for this, Bob?
Yeah.
Sterling silver faucets in the bathroom.
Oh, really?
Sterling silver. And in the Queen's, they had installed gold.
Well, how about that?
And looking at that thing, and holy buckets. But I said nothing. I was polite, kept my mouth shut. Now, it turned out that they didn't stay there. And I don't know if it was because the dog had bled on everything or whether they ended up staying at the British Embassy. But it was,
Kevin, that year, I think it was 1951, just before the then king died, I was working in Washington, and there was a story in the Post about the queen, not the queen, but the princess's visit. Mm-hmm. And wherever she stayed, somebody out there had a glass, and they were looking in the window, and they saw her smoking a cigarette. That really? Just amused me no end.
Big deal, right? Yeah.
There's a joke which is unprintable. It says something about, do the common people do this,
Yeah.
You've heard that.
Oh, yeah.
And there she was.
So we'll have to pick this up.
I enjoy this.
We'll pick it up again in a couple of weeks, and we'll talk about, because we never found out what you really thought of Roosevelt as a guy. I know one thing, though. You said his word was worthless. And,
I didn't quite say that. But, there were people who said that.
Yeah, there were people who said that. Right? You wrote that to the effect that the bosses, the big city bosses, could not figure out.
Didn't like him at all.
Didn't like him because he didn't keep his word, and these guys live by keeping their word. And,
well, the nuns told them that you're supposed to tell the truth, and they took it seriously.
Well,
they were wonderful people in that regard. We need some more of them.
I wish we had them back. Yeah, listen, Bob. We'll pick this story up and we'll talk about, because you wrote a book about this and you also mentioned it in your other book, how Truman got to be the vice president. We talked about that several years ago, but that's a wonderful story. So
well, I'd like to do that.
You know, there is an interesting story about Hoover and Truman that I'm sure you know. In 1945, when Truman took over, and Hoover gave him a call. Do you want to tell that story?
Truman gave him a call.
Oh, Truman called him. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
The president, as Hoover was known, was staying out, I think, at the Shoreham. And this voice came in and said, Mr. President, this is Harry Truman. He said, Harry who? He didn't believe it. He hadn't been in the White, yeah, and you know the rest of it.
Well, didn't he invite him over?
Yes. He said, I'm going to invite you over to see your old home. And he said, look out the window, and you're going to see a White House car down below. And you know that story there.
And well, I know, but the people ought to hear this, Bob. He brings him into the Oval Office, as I recall, and didn't he offer him something very important, some important job?
Yes, he wanted him to go abroad and survey food problems.
Mm-hmm. And Hoover was very, very touched by that, wasn't he?
Hoover actually couldn't speak, and he rather, without any signal at all, walked out of the room. And the reason was that he was in tears.
Yeah. But then in 48, as you say, Truman took a shot at him. And I always wondered why he would do that, because Truman was basically a pretty decent guy.
Oh, he had these speeches, most of them do, you know. In this case, this was written by a nice fellow in Washington. It was about, let's see, I can't remember it, but it was about a car. And it was the only car in the country that ate oats. This was because it was Tin Lizzie that was being towed by by a horse. And that was the way that things were, said Truman, until the Democrats came in 1933, which was not really true.
Well, the Democrats ran against Hoover for many, many years.
Oh, sure.
We'll pick it up next time. Our guest today, again, always great talking with Robert Ferrell, author, historian, and a wonderful guy. Thanks, Bob.